It's an absolute honor to be here today. Es un placer estar aquí con mi gente. Thank you very much for the invitation. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, and I'm going to weave that in with my own personal story and my life as a student as well as a professor, in the hopes that that might give you an idea of a possible path for yourself in the future. So I'll tell you a little bit about my career. I went to Mercer University in Atlanta for 2 years and studied secondary education, changed my major to business, realized I'd made another mistake, changed my major to computer science, and transferred to Georgia Tech and stayed there for 11 years getting 3 degrees. While I was in school, I had several different jobs. Most notably is probably working for the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games as an envoy, where I received 2 years of training in protocol and hosting international visitors, and I learned every regulation for qualifying for every Olympic sport. And I managed the team from Equatorial Guinea, which is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. That laid a lot of nice groundwork for me in terms of diplomacy that I've been able to use throughout my career. I spent 1 year at the University of South Florida in the business school as an assistant professor, and realized that I'd really missed my calling and wanted to go back to engineering. So then the next year I went to NC State University, where I was in the computer science department for 14 years and worked my way up from assistant to associate to full professor there. Had great 14 years there. And then last year I left NC State to go back to my alma mater to become a school chair. And so that's just my general career track to give you an idea of one possible path for yourself in the future. I've done a lot of work with a lot of different companies. I've done a lot of work in particular with our government and the Department of Defense. One of those, the third icon from the left on the third row, is seeing a lot of press this year, the National Security Agency. I work a lot in regulatory compliance. This is something that's been in the press a lot. I will say, for those of you who are questioning what's going on at the NSA, that the good people at the NSA work tirelessly to protect the privacy of all individuals, and they work tirelessly to design systems and business practices that comply with law. And I'll come back to that when I talk about my own research in a minute. But I'll just drop that in for now. A little about me personally. I'm the proud daughter of Cuban immigrants who came to this country with $80. They were on welfare for 2 years in Miami while they were saving pennies to be able to buy books to study to pass the foreign exam. My parents told me there are 2 things that no one can ever take away from you. Number 1 is your faith in God, and number 2 is your education. Because when they left Cuba, Castro would not let you take your diploma out of the country. But Castro could not take anything that was in your mind or your soul and your heart. And so I share that with you. There are many children of immigrants, families here, and these are values that I know are very, very tried and true in immigrant families. Remember that, because it's very true. Another thing about me is that I'm dyslexic and I have ADHD. My parents were told that I would not go to college because I was too lazy and too social. The social's definitely true still, but lazy couldn't have been further from the truth. I just have a problem. I have a chemical imbalance. I've been taking Ritalin since I was 11 years old. I would not be where I am today were it not for the medication and were it not for all of the tutoring that I received at Georgia Tech and all of my math and all of my physics classes, thanks to my parents. And so everyone will face some kind of hardship in school or in your career. And don't let anyone tell you you can't do something. You can if you put your mind to it and you really want to and you're willing to work very hard. I'm the only non-physician in my family, which makes me the black sheep. I like to think I did pretty well. But being around physicians enabled me to very early on in my career, in my life, learn about the Hippocratic Oath. My parents had it up in a stained glass little thing that they had at the house. And I remember reading, and I remember my parents talking about this because they're both psychiatrists. And so patient-physician confidentiality is especially important and sensitive when it comes to psychiatry. But the Hippocratic Oath says, whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, I will keep secret as considering all such things to be private. Okay? So when people ask me, how did you get interested in privacy and security? I always say right back to when I was a child and my parents talked about these things. So again, these are the values that have set the stage for my career. So some of you will remember this. People who are around my age will remember this. This was what the internet was like when I was a grad student. On the internet, nobody knows your dog. Everyone was anonymous. There was no tracking, right? It was all safe. You could experiment and toy around. Times have changed, though. Now, not only do they know that you're a dog, but they know that you are a German Shepherd Schnauzer mix, that you like to shop for rawhide shoes, that you like the third lassie and think she's hot, and you've sent the photo to several people, and we know who they are. So the times have changed. And now the cats are even getting in on it. And say, it's cool, I just sold the dog on eBay, right? So we laugh about that, but there are a lot of concerns that people have about their privacy. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to spend a few minutes on 3 different projects or slices of my research in this space of privacy and security and compliance to give you a glimpse of the different approaches that one takes to take a crack at the same problem. Okay? So here we're going to talk about some of our early work and trying to understand internet users' privacy values. If you've ever read an internet privacy policy, how many of you have read a privacy policy? Right, exactly, not many. And this is probably why, because when you read it, you feel like this. Congratulations, Dave. I don't think I've read a more beautifully evasive and subtly misleading public statement in all my years of government. Okay, that's what reading a privacy policy is like. And yet, it's the way that we communicate with people, businesses communicate with people about what they do. So we collected, created a survey instrument and collected information from over 1,000 internet users to determine what their privacy values are and what are they most concerned about. And what our survey instrument revealed back in 2002 was that people were concerned with information transfer, notice and awareness, and information storage. When we conducted a content analysis of over 100 internet privacy policies, what we found was that privacy policies were actually emphasizing data integrity and security, information collection, and user choice and consent. So that revealed a complete misalignment between what we as customers want to see in privacy policies and what businesses were actually expressing in their privacy policies. And so this became a very interesting result for industry. We reran the survey in 2008, because we'd realized that 10 years had passed, and we also wanted to see whether the introduction of data breach notification laws had in any way changed people's preferences and values. And so all the little red dots here indicate when new states introduced data breach notification laws, with the very first one being in 2003, the state of California, which is always the most progressive when it comes to privacy laws. What we found is that people's privacy values have not changed. They are still the same, despite all of the data breach notifications and despite everything that we read in the press and despite getting overwhelmed by privacy notices in the mail. But people have changed their level of concern about certain things. And so people are more concerned about disclosures of their purchasing patterns, and they're more concerned about the trading of their information to third parties. And they have a stronger desire to be notified about security safeguards, but they're less concerned about all the changes and notices that they receive. But they are more concerned about websites recording information about the sites that they previously visited. So again, the same values, but the level of concern has changed a little. We also had enough international participation that we were able to compare to US values, and we found that basically people overseas are also concerned about the same top 3, but the ordering is just a little different. So getting back to the dogs, I don't know what to do. The neighbor cat just sent me a friend request on Facebook. So now let me switch a little. That's about privacy values and people and trying to understand what people care about so that that can inform the way we design systems. We also want to design systems that are privacy aware by designing regulatory compliance in from the very beginning. So why should we study this? Why should a computer scientist or an engineer care about the law? Well, the fact of the matter is that regulatory compliance has been the primary driver for several years now in information security policy, according to an Ernst & Young annual global survey that they do of CIOs. In addition, we know that the cost of non-compliance is high. The landmark case of ChoicePoint several years ago, where they received a $10 million fine from the Federal Trade Commission, and they ended up spending an additional $18 million in redesigning their software systems and their business practices to comply with law. Okay, that would drown many a company. And eventually, ChoicePoint did end up selling to LexisNexis, but there are a lot of companies, if you have a startup and you can't do this, you're gonna drown. So it's very important. To be accountable, companies have to be able to demonstrate that their policies and their systems are compliant with regulations and standards. So the problem that we've seen a lot is that we typically specify the requirements for a system, we design it, we build it, and then whoops, we get a complaint that we are violating some law. And then we have to go and review the regulations. And as engineers, we've never done this before. This was not in our little bag of tricks for what we were taught often in software engineering in school. So we have to go review the regulations, which are very difficult to understand, and then identify legal requirements, and then you have to refactor and re-engineer your systems. And so what the industry best practice that we're trying to achieve is to begin from the onset of looking at what regs you have to comply with early on and design that into the system. The challenge, though, is that when you look at law, there's a ton of cross-references. And these are very important, but if you look at what's been written by a lot of folks who work in this area, they say that, well, we just assume that the cross-references are true. And that's the downfall. When you assume that, then that's when you're going to be violating law and you're going to be jeopardizing people's privacy and the security of different forms of information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these cross-references. They introduce ambiguities, exceptions, and conflicts, and requirements engineers and software engineers need guidance for how we actually handle these. So there's two goals that we're trying to achieve, and we've been told by chief privacy officers that if you can do this with your software systems, should you have a problem, should you have a data breach, for instance, and if in a court of law you can prove due diligence and standard of care, that you'll be okay. So due diligence refers to reasonable efforts that persons make to satisfy legal requirements or discharge their legal obligations. And standard of care means that under the law of negligence of obligations, the conduct demanded of a person in a situation. Typically, this involves a person giving attention both to possible dangers, mistakes, and pitfalls, and ways of minimizing those risks. And you remember I mentioned the NSA earlier. One thing that I think is pretty consistent in what's been revealed about the NSA is that they can prove due diligence and standard of care. They have meticulously been doing this. They self-report typographical errors. How many companies self-report typographical errors? And then the press reports these as privacy violations. When they're not privacy violations, they're typographical errors. So think about the standard that the NSA is being held to. It's quite different from what industry or even universities hold themselves up to. And so I just point that out because the good people up there are really doing a great job in protecting our country and our privacy. And I'll continue now. In terms of what makes laws difficult for software engineers, I'm going to focus on two things. First, the number of internal and external cross-references and how we handle those, and then ambiguities. The law is actually really laden with ambiguities. Some are intentional and some are unintentional. So here's an intentional ambiguity from the HIPAA privacy rule. It says we're going to protect against reasonably anticipated threats or hazards to the security and integrity of such information. Well, reasonable here is intentional. Why? Because the policymakers and the lawmakers didn't know what reasonable was when they wrote the law. And so they're going to let the courts decide later. And that's where case law comes from. So for those of you who have lawyers in the family and you've heard of the term case law, that's what it's referring to. It's like waiting to let the courts decide what reasonable actually is, okay? Which is a real challenge for software engineers because we don't have time to go follow case law. And then there's language ambiguities, and these are unintentional ambiguities. So here we have from HIPAA, the covered entity must promptly document and implement the revised policy or procedure. Well, the challenge is that promptly is not testable, and in engineers, we need everything to be testable. So how promptly? A day, 24 hours, 10 seconds, 5 milliseconds, right? That's not a testable specification. And so what we've been working towards is making sure that we're informing policymakers and lawmakers how you can write laws in a way that engineers can actually implement them. And so we've had a lot of success in opening the eyes of folks in DC, and we hope to one day see that manifest in the different laws that are written that affect software systems in the future. Let's get back to cross-references. There's a lot of different kinds of cross-references. I'm gonna, and here are several of the different patterns. These are exhibited in healthcare and financial privacy regs. I'm gonna talk for a second about one case study we did where we looked at all of the cross-references in the HIPAA privacy rule to other laws. So there were 177 cross-references in the HIPAA privacy rule to other laws. And those cross-references identify different kinds of conflicts, for instance, that we have to be able to deal with. So, can you really read this? No, that's great, because that's what I'm trying to get at. This is the shock value diagram. This is to show you how complex this is. These are all of the different cross-references that a software engineer has to be able to understand in order to make sure that your system is compliant with the HIPAA privacy rule, okay? When we did this, I mentioned we saw 177 different cross-references. We've developed a taxonomy for how you actually identify them and categorize them and analyze them. And why is this important? Well, the HIPAA privacy rule says that you keep personal health information for 6 years after the last use. And the Privacy Act of 1974, with which you also have to comply, says that you keep information for 5 years or for the life of the record. So if the requirements engineers focus solely on the HIPAA privacy rule, then you could specify requirements that actually fail to comply with HIPAA. And you have to be able to do that in order to show standard of care and due diligence, okay? So without checking the cross-references, you fail to do that. We've developed different conflict resolution strategies. There's several papers where you can look at this, but basically we classify different legal statements. And we use a ceiling and floor rule, and you can resolve according to the table. So I won't go into too much detail here. And then finally, there's some conflicts that really require you to consult a legal domain expert, a lawyer. And it's one of the things that is as a software engineer, we're trying to develop approaches that will enable software engineers to quickly develop a system and design the requirements and specify them so that we can minimize the amount of interaction we need with lawyers. But you always have to have them there. And you're always going to have to consult them. So here, for example, we have 2 laws that allow individuals and employees access to their health records. Both allow the covered entities employers to deny access to health records under certain circumstances, and conditions are mutually exclusive. So you need to consult with a legal expert in this case. And then here we have some example conflicting requirements. Just wanted to kind of give you an idea from above, from a distance of what this kind of work looks like. So now I'm going to go to the third study that I'm going to talk about. So the third study is an empirical study where we were observing software engineers to determine whether or not they can decide whether software requirements are legally implementation ready, meaning do they comply with the law or not. And this is work with one of my former PhD students. So Aaron Massey, who's currently a postdoc at NC State, designed an experiment where he was analyzing empirical observations of legal implementation readiness. And a requirement is legally implementation when it meets or exceeds the obligations of the law. Okay? So consider this requirement on the left side from an electronic health record system called iTrust that's being developed at NC State. that says, I trust shall allow an authenticated user to change their user ID and password. Simple enough requirement, but it actually does not comply with the law, the relevant regulation in pink on the right, which says that a unique user identification is required, and you have to assign a unique name or number for identifying and tracking the user identity. So we were trying to see whether software engineers can realize this isn't quite right, and this requirement needs to be refined. And here would be a suitable refinement. I trust shall allow an authenticated user to change their user ID and password as long as it remains unique. Okay? So we had a study in which we had 32 graduate students participating. We also had 3 experts in software engineering and regulatory compliance, including one lawyer who's also a software engineering expert in this area. We use a consensus wide by Delphi technique to reach consensus. And we were also analyzing 8 legal requirements metrics and an algorithm that's used to try to do this automatically. So we wanted to see whether the students could outperform the algorithm and whether the algorithm could outperform the experts. And so we used a section of the HIPAA with 31 requirements to analyze for regulatory compliance. And what we learned is that graduate students are ill-prepared to make legal implementation readiness decisions. And for those of you who say, well, students don't really map or reflect what practitioners do, we have also run similar studies with practitioners, and the same results still hold for practitioners as well. It's a very complex problem. It takes a lot of training to do this well. The subject matter experts also always have to be involved in legal compliance decisions, and our metrics outperform the students, but the experts outperform the metrics, and now Aaron is refining those metrics to see if we can improve upon that. So we still need to develop new technologies for privacy enforcement and privacy auditing. There's a general lack of awareness and regulation in industry, and so it suggests the need for really comprehensive privacy laws that govern all business entities. Consumers still need to be protected against privacy threats and vulnerabilities. And we need to ensure that the people who design systems and the people who design the laws that govern those systems understand that we can ensure that we implement systems that are compliant, but we all need to work together towards that. So how do we pull all of that together? I've given you little glimpses of the kind of work that we've done, always working on the same problem: designing software systems that are privacy and security aware and compliant with federal security and privacy regulations. So how would you try to have impact on a national level with that kind of work? So engineers can actually do a lot to shape public policy. And so today I want to encourage all of you, no matter if you're biologists, chemists, and mechanical engineers, civil engineers, to become an expert in whatever it is that you do. By virtue of getting a PhD, you've already become an expert of sorts. But the more that you become an expert and the more you think about the work that you're doing within the context of the world around you and within the context of public policy around you, the more impact you can have on a national level. So here are some examples of things that I've done that have enabled me to broaden the aperture of my work and the impact of my work. So for instance, I've served on the US DHS Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee, where we examine things like E-Verify and the Real ID Act and provide technical commentary there about how it should be designed and implemented. I've testified before Congress a couple of times, once on E-Verify and another time on protecting the privacy of the Social Security number against identity theft. So I encourage you, and I can tell you that I never imagined as a student that I'd get to have those opportunities. And I can tell you that as a daughter of Cuban immigrants, it was an amazing thing to sit before Congress and see that little clock say, you've got 5 minutes to try to change these people's minds about the kind of laws that we're going to have here in this country. And so if you think about how your work can have impact, it really can in amazing ways. And I encourage you to try to do that. So some final advice to students especially. How many of you are students here today? Outstanding, outstanding. So there's no such thing as too much education. If you have an opportunity to go to grad school, go. If you don't have the money to go to grad school, there's a ton of fellowships you can apply for. There are a lot of companies that will pay for you to go back to school to get your master's or your PhD. And by golly, if you love computer science as much as I do, why wouldn't you get a master's in computer science from the number 10 program in the country, where you can get a master's online for $7,000 today? Did you know that? Did you hear me? $7,000 degree program at Georgia Tech in computer science. If you haven't read about it, go look at the New York Times a few weeks ago, where our dean was on the front cover of the New York Times. Amazing what we're doing at Georgia Tech here, and I encourage you all to consider getting a master's degree at Georgia Tech. Be a leader of something. Join your local SACNAS chapter. Join SGA at your university. Those leadership skills that you acquire outside the classroom will propel you in your career in ways that you won't imagine right now. Give back to your community. Be a volunteer. Go to the soup kitchen on Saturday. Look at those around you in need and help. Be a mentor. Many of you have been mentored and are here because of that. So mentor others around you to make way for others that may follow after you. When you see a problem, whether it be technical or societal, do something about it. Don't just be one of those people that says, oh, that's a problem. Hope someone fixes it. You're here because you're a mathematician, you're an engineer, you're a scientist. And what do those three types of people do? They fix things. They solve problems. No problem is too big, right? We get people together and we address those problems. So continue to do that throughout your career. Early on in my career, when I was giving a talk at Carnegie Mellon, I had a student say at the end of my talk, he stood up and said, "This problem that you're working on is impossible. Why even bother working on it?" And I replied, well, I'm sure that a lot of people thought that when President Kennedy said in 10 years we're going to put a man on the moon. And by golly, we did. So when people challenge you and say, no, it's impossible, don't let that influence you. If you have determination and you have a vision for what can be done, go for it. And people will follow you, and people will help you. Don't ever believe anyone who tells you you can't do anything or that it's not possible. Okay? My being here today is a testament to that, because my parents were told I wouldn't even go to college. I'd love to go back to elementary school and tell the teachers who said that to my parents, not only did I go to college, I'm teaching college. And finally, be a founder of something worthy. It could be anything small, like a mentoring program at your own school, or something bigger, like my friend Jose Montero, who founded Trekking for Kids, where we've raised over $100,000 now for orphanages around the world in third world countries. Okay, so it's a voluntourism program. Make a difference. And finally, I mentioned education as a theme throughout my talk today. When I was a kid, which wasn't in the 50s, by the way, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, but my parents used to say, be sure to finish your dinner because there are children in Cuba and Ethiopia who do not have dinner tonight. So you have to eat everything on your plate. And now what we really need to be saying is, be sure to finish your homework because there are children in other parts of the world who are studying, and we have to remain competitive. And thank you very much.